User authentication schemes tend to be more effective when you ask users for more than just their email address. We also need to collect and store passwords, and we need to do that the right way. That right way is what we cover in this week's episode of Learn All the Nodes. This was our sign-up form from last week. We're going to add a password field to it because it's critical that our users' valuable data and loot be protected. And we're not going to bother with a password confirmation field. In a later episode, we'll add in a reset password flow. And then, of course, now that we have this nice password field, we'll need to hook it up on our route handler. So head over to app routes userroutes.js and make this one small change. Now we just need to wire it up on our model. It may come to mind to just add a password property to our schema. This would certainly work if we define work as allowing people to log in while simultaneously introducing a bad security hole. In general, we don't want to store passwords in the clear in our database. Instead, we'll store a hash of the password and we'll rename this property, so it's more accurate to call it password hash. Then we'll hook ourselves into Mongoose's middleware stack. We want to run a function before saving the record. Our callback has a single parameter, which will be a function we call to signal we're done and that the middleware stack can continue. By convention, we call that next. Then we check to see if we've modified the password hash property. If not, then we just bail out. Then we'll need to add in a module that will hash our password strings for us. We'll use the bcrypt module. You can read about this package at its GitHub page. It's some interesting code, so have a look at it sometime. But for now, we just install it using npm install -- save bcrypt. And of course, we can watch all the fun output as well. Back to our model, now we add in the magic sauce. We use bcrypt to make a hash of our password. We'll go define salt workfactor in just a second. This is an asynchronous function, so we provide a callback. That callback will supply us with the hash, with which we can then override the plaintext value our user supplied. And then we just call next before we're done so that the rest of the save stack can proceed. And then we just go up and actually include bcrypt and salt workfactor. Now, salt workfactor affects how long it takes to hash our passwords. The larger that number, the longer it takes to hash a password. We choose 10 as our value because that's the default value bcrypt supplies when we use one of the functions that lets us use a default. The balancing act here is between performance and security. Making it take less time makes it easier to crack passwords, but making it too long slows the site down. I've linked to a blog post that discusses these trade-offs, and I highly recommend reading it. It's down in the show notes. We'll also want to make sure that our passwords are long enough. Now, we're going to do this using the same sort of validation that we saw last time, so nothing new there. But what we have to keep in mind is that this validation will run both when we're assigning a new password or when we're just saving the record for some other reason. So the hashes that we get back from bcrypt will always be 8 characters or longer, so we can just make sure that our property is set to something that is 8 characters or longer. After fixing a quick typo, we can go make a user instance in the REPL. Notice that we are storing the password hash. We can even change the password, and when we do it, we can go look at Mongo to see that, yep, we do indeed have 2 different password hashes now. However, if we try to make a user with no password as currently implemented, we get an error. This is actually not the type of error we wanted. We have an error in our code. If the value isn't set at all, then in our validator, we get undefined instead of an empty string. But if we fix it, then we can see the error we would expect. When it's blank, the required validator kicks in, but when we do put a password that's too short, we get the error message saying that, hey, the password is too short. Our route handler was calling the password password, but we need to change its name. Then we can see that creating a new user through our sign-up form creates the user and stores it in Mongo, just like we expect. We'll close off the episode by making a way to authenticate users. We take advantage of Mongoose's statics, which I linked to in the show notes. Statics don't belong to any particular instance of our model, but are available on the model itself. We declare one by assigning it as a property to the statics property of our schema. In this case, we assign find by email and password, a function that takes an email address and a password, and then sees if there's any user that matches the combination. First, we find a user matching our email address. If we don't find one, then we can immediately return null. If we did find the user, then we use the bcrypt compare function to see if the hash of our password matches the hash we stored when we created the user. Compare gives us an error potentially, and also the result of the comparison as the second argument. Absent any errors, this gives us true if it matched and false if it didn't. So we can just invoke the top level callback as a one-liner. And being able to do all of this is a lot more useful if we also have a form for signing in. This form looks remarkably like the form for signing up, but we haven't yet hit the rule of 3 wall, so we'll just do a copy paste and a bit of modification. The rule of 3 has a Wikipedia page, so you can know that it's an immutable law of the universe. We've previously wired up the routes in config routes. Next, we make our routes around signing in. These look a lot like the routes for making new users too. But we'll just use our static function, getting the values from our request parameters. In our callback, we'll have to check for the no user case in addition to the error. But with that in place, we can display pages that differentiate between failed authentication and successful authentication. Note that this only covers authentication and not authorization. We'll have to handle that elsewhere, and we will in a later episode. Also, please do note that our user isn't actually logged in at this point. You'll notice we've done nothing with cookies or anything like that. It gets a bit boring to hear it, but we'll hit that in later episodes too. We'll use a module called Passport for this purpose, and that'll likely hit in 2 weeks. And as you've been watching here, we can see that the login form does work as we expect it to in the browser. Despite this current limitation that we can't actually log in, we did make an important step today in that we can create user accounts with passwords. All joking aside about how popular Node/ will ever become, it is important to constrain users to their own account. And if you're following along, then you're likely working on an app that will be more important than Node/. So thanks for watching and happy coding. If you've been watching the episodes and want to add any comments or questions about them, don't forget that each episode has a comments tab where you can say something. And also, the site has a feedback where you can find contact information. So if you think I'm talking too much, or maybe there are just some other topics that you want to see covered, let me know. Thanks for watching.